Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is the Smithsonian Black and African American Art Tour, part 1 of 2. So the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. is one of the world's great art museums, and they have one of the world's best, if not the best, collection of American art. So let's go talk real briefly about the American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery. The museum is an historic 18th century building in downtown Washington, D.C. It used to be the United States Patent Office. And it's a beautiful structure. And if you get a chance, you should check it out. It's worth a visit for the architectural features alone, but they also have a fabulous art collection. And look at the design of this building, that beautiful interior. I used to work not too far from here, and I used to love to walk over here after work and go roam around the galleries. But tonight we're going to be talking not so much about the architecture, but about the museum collection, in particular, the Black and African American art collection that's at the Smithsonian. This is the first of a 2-part series of programs. My name is Robert Kelleman. I'll be your host. I hope my wife, Michelle, can join us a little bit later. And we previously lived in Washington, D.C. Now I'm joining you from Dallas, Texas. So we've done a whole series of tours on the Smithsonian. We've done the presidents and first ladies. We've done figures of the Civil War, women in art. And then tonight's program is going to focus on Black and African American art, not just Black and African American artists, but patrons or subjects that were also Black and African American that are part of the Smithsonian collection. And why are we doing this tour? Well, there's a great quote by Toni Morrison, and she said, if there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And so in other words, you should be the change you want to see. When Michelle and I were living in Washington, D.C., we didn't see a tour like this at the Smithsonian, even though they have this amazing art collection. So we thought we'd make our own tour. And then with the event of COVID, we thought we would do an online version. So that's the story of our program. And again, this is part 1 of 2. So some of the artists we'll be talking about tonight include Joshua Johnson, Edmonia Lewis, Henry Ossawa Tanner, Laura Wheeler Waring, Horace Pippin, Alma Thomas, and Augusta Savage. We'll be talking about quite a few other artists besides those, but those are some of the more prominent ones we'll be featuring tonight. And let's go ahead and get started. So the first artist we're going to talk about is a gentleman by the name of Joshua Johnson. And in particular, I like American art because it tells the history of America. It tells the history of the United States. And so that's a great example here with Joshua Johnson and these spectacular portraits of a young couple from Baltimore. So here is Joshua Johnson. They don't know a lot of details about his personal life. He was born sometime around 1763. They think he passed away sometime around 1826, and he was the first African-American professional artist. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland. He was a self-taught portrait painter. And this particular painting, some people think it might actually be a self-portrait of Joshua Johnson, although the verdict is not unanimous on that. Some people think it's him, some people don't think it's him. If it's not him, then we don't have any portraits of Mr. Johnson. If it is him, you'll notice there's a ship in the background. And Baltimore was a big seafaring community during its heyday. And this particular portrait dates from 1810. This is a portrait of Miss Barbara Baker Murphy, and she's also known as wife of sea captain. And you can see it was done in 1810. Again, Johnson is the first known professional African-American artist. There were artists, African-American or Black artists during this time, but Johnson's really like the first professional one, the first one to make a living as a painter or a sculptor or anything in the visual arts. And he was a Baltimore, Maryland based artist. That's where these portraits are made. And I really like these particular images because they're so nicely detailed. And then here is that young woman's husband, portrait of Sea Captain John Murphy from the same time, 1810. So a beautiful set of husband and wife portraits. These were done as the same time, and they were depictions of people that they would prominently hang usually in their parlors. And so what would happen is people would come over, like guests, visitors, and they would see these beautiful portraits, and it was kind of a way to show off your kind of wealth, so to speak, because at this point in time, portrait paintings were relatively expensive. And if you had something like this in your home, it was really kind of like a sign of being part of either the upper class or at least the upper middle class. And so if you can imagine visiting someone's home and seeing portraits like this, kind of give off a certain image of the owners of the portraits. And here they are side by side. And these portraits were handed down through the family for several generations until they made their way to the Smithsonian. It's great that they have them together. Sometimes you see these husband and wife portraits and they've been split up. One of them is at one museum. It's great to see both of these side by side, both at the Smithsonian. Baltimore, some people might not realize, at one point in time was one of the largest cities in the United States. So you can see in the 1810 census, you have New York, largest city in America, followed by Philadelphia, and then you have Baltimore, third largest city in America back in 1810. It was a very prominent, important city for a number of reasons, including the shipping business John Murphy was a part of. And some people might be surprised to realize the large number of African Americans lived in Baltimore that weren't. So at this point in time in 1810, Baltimore has approximately 10,300 African Americans, and 55% of them are free. And that was pretty consistent with other parts of Maryland as well. So there were a number of free Blacks living in Baltimore during this time. And among those was Joshua Johnson. And here's some other works of his at other museums throughout the country. So I wanted you to get familiar with these different artists. And perhaps if you don't live near the Smithsonian, you can, or can't make it to the Smithsonian, perhaps you can visit one of these other museums. So here's a beautiful portrait of his on the left at the Art Institute Chicago, another great one of his at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, and then another beautiful one at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And he was primarily a portrait painter. And one of the things that's really neat about him is, okay, so he's an artist. How would he get commissions? Like, how would people hire him? Well, he sounds like a real marketing savvy kind of guy, because he would advertise his services in newspapers. And this particular advertisement was from a newspaper known as the Baltimore Intelligencer. And he has to say, advertisement for his services as a self-taught genius, deriving from nature and industry his knowledge of the art, and having experienced many insuperable obstacles, not sure what those are, but you can only imagine, in the pursuit of his studies, it is highly gratifying to him to make assurances of his ability to execute all commands with an effect and in a style which must give satisfaction. So an advertisement from Joshua Johnson. And then here's the portraits again. Here's the sea captain and the sea captain's wife. And here they are side by side. And then here's another great point from B. She writes in the chat, not only were portraits expensive, but you also had to have idle time to sit for them. That's a great point, B. Thanks for mentioning that. So yeah, I mean, people are usually working a lot more during this time. Leisure time would have been much more to premium, and it would take quite a while to sit for a portrait like this. I don't know if any of you ever posed for a portrait. I have. It's not the most enjoyable experience, at least it wasn't for me, even though the artist was really cool. You have to sit still for this extended period of time to get your painted portrait done. And then here's a close-up. And again, look at these great details. And pretty amazing to think that he was a self-taught artist. I always have a lot of admiration for self-taught artists, because it's tough to be any type of artist, in particular, self-taught artist. And then the Smithsonian has a number of artworks of African Americans that were done by people that weren't African American. One big reason is because in the 1800s, there were not a lot of African American artists. And so you have people being depicted by non-Blacks or non-African Americans. So let's talk about a few of those. Here is an interesting depiction. This is Confederate currency, and you can see how people were depicted in this part of the country during this era. They're actually pictured being enslaved on the currency of the Confederate States of America. So that's kind of an unusual depiction, not an uncommon depiction, but a really kind of unusual depiction. You don't really see a lot of African Americans in America art from the southern states during this time, unless it's something like this. But in the northern states, or in other places throughout the world, that was not always the case. And so here's a great portrait of Ira Aldridge as Othello from 1830. Ira Aldridge is a really fascinating figure if you like, say, acting or the theater or Shakespeare. He was born in New York, but at the age of 17, he moved to England because he wanted to be an actor, and he couldn't find any paying type performances in the United States. So like so many people have done over the years, they couldn't find what they were looking for at home, and they ventured out somewhere else and then had great career sex. And so that's what happens with him. He was known for primarily his Shakespearean roles, and he had a lot of success in Europe during his lifetime. He was one of the most famous actors in the world. And I find a lot of Americans maybe not as familiar with him, maybe as they should be, but pretty well known in Europe throughout his life. And he certainly wasn't an unknown figure in America. And I feel like in the last maybe 10 or 20 years, people have studied his life and career in a lot more detail. Here's an advertisement for him. You can see Mr. Ira Aldridge as Othello. And then if you're in Washington, D.C., the theater at Howard University is known as the Ira Aldridge Theater. So if you've been there or heard about it, wondering where that name came from. And a close-up. And this is one of the more famous portraits at the Smithsonian. It's of Frederick Douglass, and it was done around 1844. We don't know the artist who actually made this painting, which is unfortunate. It depicts Frederick Douglass, though, at the age of 26 or 27. It's interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, Frederick Douglass, there's not a lot of painted portraits of him that were done from life. Most of the images of Douglass were paintings. Douglass was really concerned about, say, the way he was depicted. I guess now they would call that like branding or image, things like that. He didn't really feel like painters could really capture the essence of it, particularly painters that weren't African American, of which there are not a lot during this time. And so usually you see photographs of Frederick Douglass. You usually don't see many paintings of him that were painted from life. There's a lot of paintings of Frederick Douglass that were done from photographs, but not many painted portraits of Frederick Douglass that he actually sat for. It's also a really unusual image because he's so youthful in this depiction. Usually when we see images of Frederick Douglass, he's much older in life, which nothing wrong with that, but really cool to see a early image of him at the age 26 or 27. And the image on the right, the photograph, is kind of what I mean. Like if you have like a mental image of what Frederick Douglass looks like, you probably think of him as more of like an older, distinguished kind of gentleman. And so the painting on the left, the Smithsonian, really cool to get a glimpse of what Frederick Douglass would have looked like as a young man. And did you know that Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery just north of Washington, D.C. in Baltimore? Remember before we were talking about how important Baltimore was as a city? And Frederick Douglass wrote in his autobiography, on Monday, the 3rd day of September, 1838, in accordance with my resolution, I bade farewell to the city of Baltimore and to that slavery which had been my abhorrence from childhood. And so Frederick Douglass escapes from Baltimore, obtains his freedom, and goes on to have an extremely successful life. Frederick Douglass got a lot of publicity and notoriety when he wrote his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Now that book came out in 1844. and kind of really got popular in 1845. And so you can see this painting on the left was done several years before that. And there's the full view. And the zoom in. Frederick Douglass. Here's a great painting. It's called Sunday Morning. It's by the artist Thomas Waterman Wood. And the painting was done around 1877. So this is about 12 years after the Civil War ended. And the themes in this painting are religion and reading. So what you have here is a grandmother and a granddaughter, and they're reading the Bible on Sunday morning. And the significance of this is during enslaved times, most slaves were not allowed to read. And if they were caught doing so, the punishment would usually be very severe. And so it would have kind of limited their ability or made it much more difficult to practice their religion. After the Civil War, that wasn't the case. And so you see sometime in paintings, people reading, as is the case here. And so really beautiful painting. I really like the grandmother and the granddaughter subjects here. And again, this is the artist Thomas Waterman Wood. Now, there's a similar version of this painting at my former employer, the Detroit Institute of Arts. And this one also is from around 1877. This one's a little more detailed than the one at the Smithsonian. So here's the one at the Smithsonian. Here's the one at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And here they are side by side. So let's check in with Patty. Patty, hi, sorry, we got kind of a quick start this morning, I think, or this evening, a chance to introduce you. Thanks for joining us. What do you love about this painting? I saw your comment in the chat. Any particular thing strike you about this one?
I love the warmth of it, the color, as well as the setting and the mother or grandmother and daughter. Just there's just like such a coziness to it, even though it's clearly a very humble home.
Yeah, I really like this painting a lot. And one reason I like doing programs like this is maybe to get people familiar with art or artists that they haven't heard of before. So, you know, we talk about Van Gogh and Monet and Edward Hopper and George O'Keeffe and all that stuff. And great to kind of learn about some other artists and see works that they've done.
Robert, while I have your attention, I am noticing here that a few times your voice like disappears and then comes back. I'm not sure if anybody else is having that.
Oh, I'm broadcasting from a different location than normal. So thanks. We'll have to keep an eye on that. I appreciate you giving me the heads up on that.
Yeah, well, especially since you're recording it, I wanted to make sure you were aware.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. All right. Well, let's keep an eye on that. Keep an ear on that, or both. All right, let's continue on. And here's a close-up again. Really like this painting a lot. As Patty said, it's really kind of got a homey feel to it. And then here's an artist that you might not recognize his name, Eastman Johnson, but you might recognize some of his works. In particular, the painting on the left is really well known. I frequently see it in different kind of media contexts. The painting on the right is not quite as well known, but still a work I see from time to time. The painting on the right is actually set in Washington, D.C., and this artist is Eastman Johnson. And here's a work of his at the Smithsonian, The Lord is My Shepherd, from 1863. This would have been done during the middle of the Civil War, and really kind of depicts the subject of emancipation. And again, we have this religion and reading themes here. This gentleman is probably reading the Bible. It doesn't define him for sure, but a lot of people think that he's a Union soldier because he has this blue, kind of navy blue coat that a lot of the Union troops wore, including the U.S. colored troops. And Eastman Johnson was not an African-American artist. The particular artists, for the most part in this section, are Caucasian artists. However, you would frequently see depictions of African-Americans in his artwork. And I really like this painting a lot. This gentleman is reading his Bible. He's very deep in thought. It's kind of a quiet, personal, intimate kind of moment. And the theme again of reading and religion by Eastman Johnson. All right, one of the most famous artists in American art history, particularly in the 1800s, is Winslow Homer. Homer did a variety of subjects, portraits, genre paintings, landscapes and seascapes, etc. And he frequently included African Americans as subjects in his artwork. These are three well-known examples that are at other museums throughout the United States. But let's look at some of his works that are at the Smithsonian. So this particular painting I like a lot. It's from 1876, and it's called A Visit from the Old Mistress. And it really has to do with kind of like the new reality of plantation life, and the kind of more equality that would be taking place than would have in, say, decades earlier. And it's also got an interesting kind of marriage theme to it, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So here is the painting, and you have three African Americans, and it looks like they're kind of like in a mini standoff with a white woman on the right. One of the three African American women holds a small child. Looks like they're in a cabin. You can see a fireplace on the left. And then if you zoom in, so we're not quite sure what the situation is here, but it looks like it's a little on the intense side. The staring between the figures is very interesting. And if you focus on these two figures in particular, oops, notice how Homer has them at equal levels. And so I think he did this on purpose, if I had to guess. He's maybe perhaps trying to portray the equality that's taking place now between the two races, because they don't have one figure higher than the other one. They're both at the same point. And then another interesting aspect about this painting is this woman has a wedding ring on. And the significance of that is that's another thing that would have been, say, somewhat problematic during enslaved time. A number of enslaved people were married, but the marriages weren't legally recognized, at least not in the southern states. And African Americans also frequently weren't allowed to marry. They pretty much oftentimes had to get permission. And so the fact that this woman has a wedding ring and no doubt made her own choice is pretty significant in the painting as well. And so Winslow Homer. And so again, these are paintings, not all the artists that we're featuring tonight are Black and African American. Many of them are, but sometimes the subject matter is Black and African American. This isn't the case here. All right, let's talk about the great sculptor from the 1800s, Edmonia Lewis. And these are three of her works. In particular, this work on the right is one of the most famous sculptures in American history, and it's her most famous work. And here is Edmonia Lewis. She's born in 1844. She passed away in 1907. She was a neoclassical sculptor, and she had a Native American mother and an African American father. And her subjects frequently include Native American or African American themes. We'll see some examples of that in just a moment. And like Ira Aldridge, she fled the United States and settled in Rome. And she was active there from 1866 to 1907. And the photograph of her on the left is a well-known image. And here's an early example of her work. This is from 1866. It's done in marble. And Anna Quincy Waterston was the wife of a famous Reverend Watson of Boston, and they were early patrons of hers. When she made this, she was only 22 years old. She had been classically trained as a sculptor in art school. And look at the incredible details on this as a 22-year-old artist working in marble. And then here's kind of a profile, slightly profile view, and then the full frontal view. And again, really incredible details on these sculptures. And in the back view, now, the American Civil War, of course, ended in 1865, but there were still a lot of, say, issues going on after 1865, including up into more recent times. And so just because the Civil War ended doesn't mean everything was, say, peaches and cream for different groups of Americans. And so Edmonia Lewis, she was studying art in school and she's trying to find her way as an artist. And she got involved in a few, say, racial type incidents. And she ends up leaving the United States because of that. And she travels to Rome and she kind of sets up shop there, so to speak. And so American-born artist moves to Italy and finds great success in Rome in Italy. And why did she leave the United States? Well, here's a quote from her. Now, remember, she left the year after the Civil War. I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain the opportunities for art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor. Quote from Edmonia Lewis. And here are some of her other works that are at other museums. You may have seen these in your travels or museum visits. And her works frequently either have Native American themes, African American themes, sometimes Christian themes, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the most famous image of Edmonia Lewis. So this was taken by a friend of hers, the photographer Henry Rocher, 1870. And she's living in Rome and she's 26 years old when this picture is taken. And one of the things that I always find interesting is what kind of images or imagery do people think of when they consider a well-known prominent person? And so it's always kind of funny, like for instance, go like, what image does Wikipedia use for these prominent people? And the Wikipedia entry for Edmonia Lewis, they went with this portrait at the Smithsonian. And again, it was taken by a photographer friend of hers. And then let's look at some more works of hers. This is Wendell Phillips from 1871. It's a circular marble piece. She did a series of prominent abolitionists, including this one. This particular work was 18 inches in diameter. This is from 1871. Here's Hagar. This is a marble sculpture. Edmonia Lewis had a really strong Catholic faith. So frequently with her artwork, you see a lot of Christian themes. If you're not familiar with Hagar, this was the story of Ishmael. Hagar was the mother of Ishmael, and Hagar had a relationship with Abraham, and the two of them had a child, Ishmael. Hagar from the Bible and Ishmael. If you don't know the story of Hagar, she and her son were banished into the desert by Abraham, and they almost died of thirst. But then Hagar kept her faith, and at the last minute before they would have died, an angel guided them to water. So you frequently see Hagar depicted with like a vase or something that would hold water, or like a stream or something like that. So that's what's taking place here. If you're wondering what the detail is on that. And you can see she's looking up towards the heavens for divine inspiration or intervention or both. And then this is Edmonia Lewis's most well-known work. This is The Death of Cleopatra from 1876. Cleopatra lived from 69 BC to 30 BC, And this is a life-size sculpture. So if you go to the Smithsonian and see this, it's up on the top floor. If you get a chance, you can go check it out there in person. But it's 63 inches high and it weighs 3,000 pounds. So you don't have to worry about anybody stealing this one. It's so heavy. Now, Cleopatra, I think for a lot of Americans, when they think of Cleopatra, they might think of the great Elizabeth Taylor film from the 1960s. But Cleopatra was a prominent figure in art and literature. You see depictions of her over and over again. So it wasn't uncommon for Cleopatra to be depicted in different art forms. It wasn't, Liz Taylor did a lot to make Cleopatra famous, but Cleopatra was famous long before Liz Taylor came along and played her in the great film. And there was an event called the Centennial Exposition of 1876 that was held in Philadelphia. And Edmonia Lewis was invited to submit a sculpture for the exposition. And this is the one that she submitted, Cleopatra. So that would have been quite an honor for her. And then here is a side view. There's usually two different types of depictions of Cleopatra. One is, so if you don't know the story of Cleopatra, she allegedly, or supposedly, legend has it, died by suicide by having a poisonous snake bite her because she didn't want to be captured by the Romans. And so usually the depictions of her are either right before she dies by suicide as she's kind of contemplating that decision, or immediately afterwards, which is the case here. And you got to remember, this is the Victorian era. And so when this came out, it was really shocking to a lot of people because it was so graphic. I mean, it might not seem all that graphic to us now in modern times, but back then, you didn't see stuff like this. This would have really shocked the general public. This got a lot of publicity and notoriety, like, oh my God, look at her, she's died and she's lifelike. Oh my goodness. So really caused quite a stir at the exposition. But if you're an artist, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so you can see the snakes bit her and she has passed away, Cleopatra. But it's a really incredible sculpture to see in person. The pictures don't do it justice. This is an interesting one too, because it's always neat to see what kids do in art museums and how they react. And kids always get a kid like, what's going on with this sculpture type of thing. This sculpture was well known, but for a number of decades it was lost. Art historians knew about the sculpture, but they didn't know where it was at. It disappeared. And then lo and behold, they found it in Chicago and was being stored outside, and the Smithsonian acquired it, brought it back to DC, or brought it to DC and restored it. So it's an interesting personal history. Patty, any thoughts about Cleopatra?
Yeah, I like the sculpture a lot. Cleopatra personally, obviously I didn't know her, but there's a lot of different takes on her and the development of European history, don't you think?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Oh, Sandra brought up a good point. She said, I'm sure seeing her nipples was a shock. Yeah, good point, Sandra, that again, this is the Victorian era, and seeing any type of nudity definitely would have been a shock to a lot of people. So
yeah, the way the fabric drapes is very, very sensuous.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really incredible. And again, this is a life-size sculpture. It's not like this is only 12 inches high. And a few people have asked if I'll ever stream the Cleopatra movie with Elizabeth Taylor. I was actually thinking about it, so stay tuned for that. Won't be happening in the next couple of weeks, but maybe later this year. And then here's a great quote from Moni Luz. I like to include quotes from the artists. I talk about the artists, but it's great if you can learn about them from their own words. And Edmonia Lewis, even though she was successful, she had a lot of challenges in life that she had to overcome. And she's really a great inspirational story. And she said in one particular interview, sometimes the times were dark and the outlook was lonesome, but where there is a will, there is a way. It was hard work though, but with color and sex against me. You got to remember, it wasn't just racism, but also gender issues that were challenges for her she had to overcome. I have achieved success, That is what I tell my people whenever I meet them, that they must not be discouraged, but work ahead until the world is bound to respect them for what they have accomplished. And interestingly enough, Edmonia Lewis's gravesite was not well maintained, and kind of the word got out that, gee, she's just been, put in the cemetery, and so some funds were raised to kind of clean up her gravesite, so to speak. And so Edmonia Lewis, if you get a chance, you can visit her sculptures at a museum near you. I frequently see her works at museums, but she's not as well known as she should be. She's not unknown, but I'd like to get her more well known. So here's one of my favorite artists. This is Henry Ossawa Tanner. Let's talk about him. And here's his portrait. He's born in 1859. He passed away in 1939. He also was an expat. He was active in Paris from around 1891 till he died in 1937. And he's kind of the first world famous African-American artist. There were a lot of other African-American artists before him, but he's really the first guy that's like globally famous. People in Paris and London and different parts of the world knew about him. He primarily did a lot of portraits and genre scenes, and you see a lot of Christian themes in his artwork. And here's portraits that he made of his parents. And Henry Ossawa Tanner's father, Benjamin Tucker Tanner, he was a famous religious leader and writer and community activist, et cetera, et cetera. He was born in Pennsylvania, but most of his adult life and his career, Benjamin Tucker Tanner lived in Washington, D.C. and Maryland, and he's Frederick Douglass, or not Frederick, sorry, gosh. He's Henry Ossawa Tanner's father. I thought of Frederick Douglass because it's thought that this painting was done at a memorial to Frederick Douglass. Douglass had died, I think, 2 years before this painting was made, and there was a big kind of memorial event in Washington, D.C. At that time, which Henry Ossawa Tanner's father, Benjamin Tucker Tanner, participated in. And it's thought that this was when the portrait was made. And then this is his wife, Sarah Tanner. And I think this was made around the same time, 1897. Henry Ossawa Tanner's father was born a free man. His wife, or not his wife, his mother was born enslaved, though, and she actually escaped on the Underground Railroad as a young girl with her family. So interesting kind of contrast between the father's history and the mother's history. And this was in the artist's personal collection. He saved this painting his whole life. And, you got to remember, this is a time when, photography had been around for a while, but painted portraits still play an important role in art history. And so interestingly enough, that Henry Ossawa Tanner kept this painting in his personal collection his entire life, never sold it. And father and mother. If you're in Philadelphia, you can visit this historical marker, which is where Henry Ossawa Tanner was born. And then he later studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. While living here, Tanner studied in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. His earlier works portrayed the ordinary lives of African Americans. After moving to Paris, Tanner painted religious subjects and won international acclaim. So Tanner leaves America, like a number of people have done over the years, including a lot of African American artists of different types, and settles in Paris. Here is a famous photograph of him at the age of 38, taken in 1897. And when asked why he moved from the United States to Paris, he famously said, "I cannot fight prejudice and paint at the same time." And here's a religious work by Tanner, Lions in the Desert. Tanner did a number of paintings of lions, and he never saw any lions up close in person in Africa. There were some in zoos and things like that, but he paints lions over and over again. It was thought that he really liked the symbolism and the connection to Africa that lions had. He did numerous studies of this particular painting before he actually made it, but there's quite a few paintings that Tanner did, and also drawings and kind of prep work of lions that you can find at different museums. And then this young lady would end up being Henry Ossawa Tanner's wife. She was a Swedish American opera singer. They were married in 1899. So this painting was actually done a couple years before she and Henry were married. And it's a really interesting portrait because on the one hand, look at how detailed her face is. But the lower portion of the portrait is much more of like an impressionistic style. So it's kind of combining two different styles, more of like a realism type portrait on the top and more of like an impressionist type portrait on the bottom. So the impressionist style with her dress and her torso, and then more of a realism type depiction on her profiled face. Now, when I was researching Tanner a few years ago, I came across this letter that was written about him. And so this was written by a woman named Virginia Walker Corse. She was a pretty well-known person in French artistic circles. But if you think that Tanner is in the United States, think again. So this woman writes a friend of hers, and she says, and she knew Tanner's future wife. And she says, Fan, did you ever hear of a Miss Olson of Portland? Meaning Portland, Oregon. She has a beautiful voice. She was a singer, I believe, and came to Paris to cultivate it. And she has married a darky artist. He is an awfully talented man, but he is black. She seems like a well-educated girl and very nice, but it makes me sick to see a cultivated woman marry a man like that. I don't know his work, but he is very talented, they say. So the reason why I wanted to share this excerpt from this article was because Tanner left the United States because of racism. And I'm sure it was less having to deal with that in Paris, but there was still issues that he faced and challenges that he faced. And so this excerpt from this letter is kind of a classic example of some of the people that Tanner would have had to deal with and the challenges that he would have had to overcome as an artist. But overcome them he did. He becomes one of the most famous artists, not just one of the most famous African artists, just one of the most famous American artists, period. If you made a list of, I don't know, top 10 artists top 10 American artists of the second half of the 1800s, Tanner would be on that list. He's one of the great artists during the 1800s. These are some other works of his, and interesting that his style changed. So the early works kind of have more of a focus on portraits and genre scenes. Genre scenes are like kind of everyday scenes of life. And he used a subject or a style called expressive realism. And so the banjo player here is one of his most famous early works, see on the left. Now his later works, though, became much more impressionistic in style, and he focused much more on Christian themes, as it's shown on the right. So two great paintings show kind of the transition of Tanner's subject and style throughout his career. This particular painting is at Hampton University Museum in Hampton, Virginia. I used to live in that part of the country, beautiful area, the Tidewater area or the Hampton Roads area. It's called The Banjo Player from 1893. And this particular painting is at my former employer, the Detroit Institute of Arts. This is called Flight into Egypt from 1897. And why does he paint all these religious themes? Well, a few quotes from letters that Tanner wrote. He said in one instance, I've made up my mind to serve him, meaning God, more faithfully. And then in another letter he wrote to a friend, I will preach with my brush. Remember, Tanner's father was a minister, and later in life, he became very religious himself. And so you see frequently Christian themes in Tanner's later works, as evident by these three examples of the Smithsonian. So you have Jesus on the left, the city of Bethlehem in the center, and Mary on the right. He did a number of other works, though, of religious theme. This is Psalm. This is from 1900. And if you don't know this particular story in the Bible, she was the woman that was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. And this is an interesting work because Tanner, by all accounts, was a pretty, say, conservative guy, not politically, but just like how he lived his life. But yet this is a very sensual portrait of Salam, a key figure in the Bible, one of the more well-known stories of the Bible. It's really interesting that he depicts her in this way because Tanner's not known as being like a sensual, erotic kind of artist per se. But it's a beautiful painting nonetheless. I really like the blue colors, and it's got kind of like a mystery to it, so to speak, at least in my opinion. And you can see John the Baptist down here, at least a portion of him. And then here's a painting called The Savior from the early 1900s. And this is I like Tanner's work because it's really, to me, thought-provoking. Like I almost kind of want to meet him and ask him questions. Like, okay, this is Jesus in prayer. And this particular type of Jesus looks really different than what we're used to seeing. This one, he looks much more like a real person, like a regular guy. And frequently when you see depictions of Jesus, particularly from this era, he's much more idealized, which is nothing wrong with that kind of style. But interesting that Tanner kind of just chose to depict him as like a regular everyday person in this painting. And then this painting has been titled. Some people, though, kind of think that the theme of this painting it was done in Morocco because Tanner visited there. But some people think that he's really kind of substituting Morocco for Bethlehem because Tanner did a whole series of paintings on Mary and Joseph fleeing Bethlehem. And to many people that have studied Tanner's life, they thought that he was drawn to the story of Mary and Joseph because, on the one hand, Tanner's really religious. On the other hand, Tanner had to flee the United States because of all the racist situations he found himself in. So some people think that he really identified with Mary and Joseph, the fact that they fled to Bethlehem, kind of like how he fled to Paris, because you see Mary and Joseph in numerous Tanner paintings. And I really love the colors of this one as well. And again, this was done in Morocco. People think he was substituting that for Bethlehem. And then here's another great painting. This is of Mary from 1914. And Mary is a figure that's frequently depicted in art, as you can imagine. And she's really kind of a symbol of faith and fortitude. And you frequently see Mary depicted with light. And so that's the case here. Notice on the left side of the painting, it's pretty dark. But you can see she's holding this light here, and there's some light shining in. It usually kind of represents her faith in God. And again, kind of an impressionistic style of painting. Doesn't look like a photograph per se. And so then Henry Ossawa Tanner, we talked about his early works. He usually was doing portraits and genre scenes. This kind of style was called expressive realism. Great example of that on the left. And then his later works, the subject and the style changed. So the subject became Christian themes and the style became Impressionism. So really fascinating to see an artist when their style changes over the course of time in their career. Alicia says, I love the symbolism of this. Thank you. Appreciate that. And there you have it, Henry Ossawatam. This is John Sloan. He was a Caucasian American artist. He's one of the most famous painters of the early 1900s. This is a portrait that he did of an African American young woman named Gwendolyn. This is from around 1918. It's unfortunate we don't know her last name. Like Gwendolyn who? And whenever I see a portrait like this, we don't know the person's name. I think, gosh, this could be someone's great grandmother. Maybe this woman had children and grandchildren and all that stuff, but we don't know who this is. So, hey, if you are if you have an ancestor named Gwendolyn that was living in the Philadelphia or New York City area, who knows? Maybe this is one of your distant relatives. And Sloan was a famous artist of the Ashcan school. And really great portrait by him. It's just a shame we don't know who her last name is. All right, this is another artist that is not African American. This is Arthur Lee. He was a European artist. And in 1912, he made this beautiful, incredible bronze sculpture called the Ethiopian. The Ethiopian is the title of that work is actually this particular gentleman, John Lester Johnson, who was a boxer and an actor. He was born in 1893. He passed away in 1968. Johnson was one of the first famous African-American athletes. And at the time, boxers were really kind of considered like, the essence of the perfect male specimen, so to speak, regardless of whether they were white or black. And that's the case here. The title of the sculpture, the Ethiopian, let's see, how can I say this? Kind of like how a lot of people just, if someone is Hispanic or Latino, they say they're Mexican, even if they're from Costa Rica or Guatemala. Well, kind of a similar thing here. So the reason why the sculpture is called the Ethiopian is because Ethiopia was a country in Africa. And even though most people from Africa weren't from Ethiopia or didn't have ties there, it was kind of one of the more well-known places. It's kind of an unusual title of this sculpture because John Lester Johnson, the subject, he obviously was not from Ethiopia either, but he was a world famous athlete. And the sculptor, he frequently did nude sculptures, both men and women, all different types of races. You can see a depiction of him here next to the sculpture that's at the Smithsonian, along with a couple other works of his. He was a European artist. And then here's a side view. And a view of the top. Johnson was a world famous boxer, and then later on, he became a famous actor. So he transitioned from sports to cinema. And then this is the famous artist, Georgia O'Keeffe. And this is a portrait of a friend of hers, Buford Delaney, that she did in 1943. This is a really unusual painting because it's a pastel by Georgia O'Keeffe. She did not do a lot of portraits. What she did in this particular instance, because Buford Delaney was a good friend of hers. And if you're not familiar with him, he was an American modernist painter. He had a very talented artist in his own right, and a great pastel profile portrait of Buford Delaney by Georgia O'Keeffe. And here's a picture of Buford Delaney with some of his works. He was known primarily as a portrait artist, Buford Delaney was, and he was friends with Georgia O'Keeffe. And they have a number of O'Keeffe's works at the Smithsonian. But whenever people think of Georgia O'Keeffe, they think of her flower paintings or perhaps her landscapes from New Mexico. And so you don't see many portraits by Georgia O'Keeffe. So really unusual work in that regard. And it's a great pastel depiction. And I like this portrait a lot. I wish Georgia O'Keeffe would have done more portraits because I think she did a great job in this one. And I would have liked to see others by her. But She was focused on other things. And then this is Laura Wheeler Waring, and some portraits that she did. Laura Wheeler Waring, she's born in 1887. She passed away in 1948. She was an art teacher in addition to being an artist. A lot of times throughout history, including even in today, it can be challenging for an artist to make a living full-time as an artist. So you frequently see people doing something else. And so in this particular instance, Laura Wheeling, she supplemented her artistic career producing art while also being an art teacher. She was one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance. And what happens with her, she ends up taking a few trips to Paris. And when she did, she really got inspired to create great art. She was already an artist before she went to Paris, but she took several trips there. And it's always fascinating to kind of look at her artwork after she returned. It really must have inspired her. And she's known primarily for her portraits of African Americans. And here's a good example of hers. She did a whole series of figures that were important in the Harlem Renaissance, whether they were artistic figures, literary figures, scientific figures, etc. And here's another one. This is Marian Anderson from 1944. This is perhaps the most famous painted portrait of Marian Anderson. There's a number of great images of her. Marian Anderson, don't know, she was a famous singer, and this particular work done in 1944. So it's hard to say which portrait is the most famous of Anderson, but if this one isn't the most famous, it's one of them. And Anderson famously performed at the Lincoln Memorial in 1938. So not only is this painting at the Smithsonian, but Washington, D.C. played a really important role in Anderson's life because she was not allowed to perform at the Daughters of the American Revolution Hall in Washington, D.C. And so she ends up getting assistance, intervention from Eleanor Roosevelt, among other people. She ends up performing at the Lincoln Memorial. And it actually ended up working out good for her because it got Marian Anderson a lot of press coverage and fame. And if you're not familiar with the term, the Harlem Renaissance, it was an intellectual and cultural revival of African-American art, dance, fashion, literature, music, theater, and politics, centered in Harlem, New York City, during the 1920s through the early 1940s. And so the artist ends up making a series of artworks featuring people from the Harlem Renaissance. And I love this portrait, Marian Anderson, her beautiful dress. She looks very poised. It's got great colors in it, both in her dress and the background, even the little window here. And then interesting that the background and the floor are really plain. So it kind of draws our focus on Marian Anderson so we don't get distracted, except this little window out here into the world, add some color. And then this is a portrait of Alma Thomas. We're actually going to be talking about Alma Thomas in a little bit. Her and Laura Wheeler Waring were friends. And so in 1945, Laura Wheeler Waring made a portrait of Alma Thomas. And the subject is an artist, and they friends and colleagues. So hold this thought because we're going to talk about Alma Thomas a little bit later. This is Betsy Graves Raynow. She was a Caucasian artist, but she was commissioned to do a number of portraits of prominent Americans. And some of them just happened to be African Americans, as in the case here with this 1942 example of George Washington Carver, Mary McLeod Bethune, 1943. She's a famous educator. course, George Washington Carver was a famous scientist, among other things, an educator himself. Mary Bethune was also a famous educator, an important political figure. Another great portrait of Marian Anderson. Here she is performing at the Lincoln Memorial, that famous concert she had in Washington, D.C. from 1944. William Ayers Campbell, he was a famous military figure from World War II. He was a pilot. I love the detail in this work also. One of the things that's fascinating about portraits is, they're all kind of similar. They're depictions of people, but yet artists take all these different approaches with them. You never get tired of looking at portraits of artworks. And here's Joe Louis, famous boxer from my hometown of Detroit. And Richmond Arte, he was a famous African-American sculptor. I really like this portrait as well because it's got him with one of his sculptures. And he's facing us. The sculpture's in profile. And Mary Mills. And again, another beautiful portrait. Thurgood Marshall, 1956. All right, another one of my favorite artists is Horace Pippin. He was born in 1888. He passed away in 1946. He was a World War I veteran. He's another artist who's mostly self-taught. He's a prominent figure of the Harlem Renaissance, and he's known for doing history, paintings, and genre scenes. Let's talk about Mr. Horace Pippin. And here's his work that's at the Smithsonian. It's called Old Black Joe from 1939. It's a really fascinating painting. It has a lot of kind of symbolism and interesting things to look at and talk about. So let's do that. This is a historical genre scene. So historical in the sense that this is depicting something from times past. Genre scene, meaning that it's depicting kind of a scene of everyday life. The subject is kind of slavery and plantations. And this particular painting was actually commissioned for a magazine advertisement. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. And so here it is, Old Black Joe. So you have an older African-American gentleman, and he's sitting on a bench here. He's got a cane or a walking stick, and there's like a little string here, a rope or something attached to this small child. They're in what looks like maybe perhaps some type of field. And then over here, there's like this plantation home, and there's this woman off in the distance. She's kind of keeping an eye on things. All right, now Horace Pippin has a fascinating story. He was a participant in World War I, and he was a member of a group known as the Harlem Hellfighters. And he almost got killed during World War I. Pippin and one of his counterparts were in a foxhole in France, and they went to charge forward, and the friend was shot and killed. Pippin was shot in the arm. And both of them fell back into their foxhole, with Pippin landing first, and then the friend who was killed landing on top of him. And Pippin was so severely injured, he could not move. And then he has his dead comrade laying on top of him. So he thought he was going to be killed himself or die. But eventually some colleagues came and rescued Pippin and took him to safety. And he went into rehabilitation and stuff like that. And his right arm was severely injured. And so he had a hard time, getting on, and he's going through physical therapy and stuff like that. And while he's over in Europe, he starts drawing. He was interested in art as a young child. but didn't really get to study it professionally or anything like that. But he starts making these drawings of his time over in Europe, and as well as recording journal entries and things like that. And then here's a quote from Horace Pippin. So during this kind of physical therapy, and some of the people that were helping him encouraged him to pursue his art. So he ends up doing that. And then he ends up becoming a really successful artist. So you kind of wonder, well, gee, what would have happened if he would have never got shot and injured in World War One? And so he said later in a quote, "I did not care what or where I went. I asked God to help me, and he did so. And that is the way I came through that terrible and hellish place." He's talking about being involved in Europe in World War One. "For the whole entire battlefield was hell, so it was no place for any human being to be." But then he said in a later interview, "The war brought out the art in me." And so again, you have Pippin. He's part of the Harlem Hellfighters. He would actually end up earning a Purple Heart for his service. He almost gets killed, but because of his, injury, he ends up pursuing art and then becomes a successful artist. So really kind of interesting story. The Horace Pippin home is in Westchester. It's a suburb of Philadelphia. After he got out of the army, he moved here, and he ends up living here for the last 26 years of his life. And you can see the historical marker. Born in Westchester in 1888, Pippin occupied this house from 1920 until his death in 1946. Self-taught Black artist, he painted while living here such notable works as Domino Players, John Brown Going to His Hanging, and the Holy Mountain series. And then on the left is a photographic portrait of Pippin. On the right is a painted self-portrait of Pippin. And this photographic portrait at the Smithsonian, 1940, as is this portrait. Oh, sorry, I said this was a self-portrait. It's not. It was actually painted by a friend of his from 1939. And again, Pippin's one of my favorite artists. Here are a couple other examples of his works. This is at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. This is John Brown Going to His Hanging. And so Pippin does a number of history scenes. Pippin said that his grandmother was actually at John Brown's hanging. So he felt a really strong personal connection to that important historical event. And then he frequently did genre scenes, which are like kind of scenes of everyday life. So here you have a family going about their business, and this is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. But let's talk about this painting at the Smithsonian, Old Black Joe. So Old Black Joe, not maybe as well known now, but back in the day, this was a famous song. And here are some of the lyrics from it. It originally came out in 1860. It's written by Stephen Foster, and it's about an old African-American man who's kind of reminiscing about his prior life. And the song goes, "Gone are the days when my heart was young and gay. Gone are my friends from the cotton fields away. Gone from the earth to a better land I know. I hear their gentle voices calling Old Black Joe." And so interestingly enough, Pippin names this painting Old Black Joe, perhaps a guy reminiscing about his life, or perhaps he's actually living during this time that's depicted in the painting. And interestingly enough, this painting, if you wonder like, well, why do these artists make these works, or who paid for them or bought them or something like that? Well, this particular painting was actually commissioned by a radio manufacturer. So back in the day when radios were large, or record players and things like that, they were like pieces of furniture. This particular company commissioned Pippin to do artwork for a magazine advertisement. So if you can imagine, say, this advertisement appearing in things like Life magazine and Time magazine, and they commissioned Pippin to do an artwork that kind of represented American music. And so the theme that Pippin chose. Remember, Old Black Joe was a famous song that people would be more familiar with back then. And he does that in his painting. So that's kind of the interesting backstory with this, how it came to fruition. And the other interesting thing about this work is that it was a response to Gone with the Wind. So Gone with the Wind, famous movie, came out in 1939. And maybe not so much then as it is now, but still to a certain degree, when Gone with the Wind came out, people thought it really kind of glorified the American South and slavery. And you hear kind of people talking about that more now than you did, say, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago, at least in my opinion. And so Pippin, though, he was kind of immediately tuned into this. And so his painting is kind of a partially response to Gone with the Wind, because he did the work the same year that Gone with the Wind came out. And I love this quote from Pippin. Some of these artists, God, I really wish I could meet them and talk to them and ask them questions and stuff. And so here's a great quote from Pippin. I don't go around making up a whole lot of stuff. I paint it exactly the way it is and exactly the way I see it, including with Old Black Joe. And so this is a historical genre scene. You kind of see it's depicting the plantation life and kind of this figure here. He's kind of literally and metaphorically tied to slavery. And so a really interesting painting. This is why it's great to study art and art history, because if you might walk by this at the museum, like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool, that's interesting work, but you start to think about it and process it and learn about it. A lot of these works have really interesting stories, including this one. There's that woman in the background, keeping an eye on things. And there's our central figure and the small child. And that's Horace Pippin, one of my favorite artists. All right, this is Alma Thomas. Remember, we saw her earlier. Look at these cool paintings. Alma Thomas was born in 1891. She passed away in 1978. She had a really fascinating life. She was part of the Great Migration, and she ended up making her way to Washington, D.C. She was a professional artist, but not until the age of 69. So if you're still trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up, Alma Thomas didn't become a professional painter until she was 69 years old. And she's known for her works that feature abstraction and color, and in particular, her space series. So the Great Migration, one of the key events in American history. You have a lot of African Americans leaving the South. Some of them go to points west, a lot of them go to points north, including Alma Thomas. And she would write, when I finished grade school in Columbus, Georgia, there was nowhere that I could continue my education. So my parents decided to move the family to Washington, D.C. And then another time, for instance, she said, when I entered the art room in Washington, D.C., it was like entering heaven, and it laid the foundation for my life. So Alma Thomas initially became an art teacher, but it's really interesting or fascinating that her parents, realizing that she would not be able to get a very good education down south, became part of the Great Migration. They move up to Washington, D.C. And I guess it paid off because she became a famous artist. And if you're in Washington, D.C., you can actually visit Alma Thomas's home. It's run by the National Park Service. So Alma Thomas lived here from 1907 to 1978 at 1530 15th Street Northwest. I used to actually just work a few blocks from here. And if you're familiar with Washington, D.C., it's in the Logan Circle neighborhood. So this is the Alma Thomas residence. It's run by the National Park Service. Make sure you check that out. Now, remember, we saw Laura Wheeler Waring, who was a friend of Alma Thomas, do a portrait of her back in 1945. And so initially, Alma Thomas was a public school teacher, and she did that from 1914 to 1960. And she had graduated from Howard University back in 1924. So she's a public art school teacher. And then when she retires, she's like, you know what? I think I've been teaching people my whole career. I think I'll just become an artist myself. And that's what she ends up doing. And she ends up becoming one of the most famous artists in the American 20th century. Now, here are some other works of Alma Thomas's that are at museums that aren't the Smithsonian. And again, she's known for doing these beautiful abstractions that have this really fabulous color composition. So this is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. on the left. And then this is at the Art Institute of Chicago on the right. And again, I wanted to show you the paintings that are at the Smithsonian, but I also wanted to kind of show you some other examples of these artists' works so you can kind of get more familiar with what they're all about, or perhaps it'll motivate you to go visit some of these other places. And here's a work of Alma Thomas's. It's at the Smithsonian. It's called Light Blue Nursery from 1968. And again, she didn't become a professional artist until 1960 when she retired as a public art school teacher. Imagine that. And beautiful colors in her paintings and distinctive composition. And so Alma Thomas, she's pursuing her professional art career during the 1960s, and one of the big landmark events in American history, or actually just world history, was when the Apollo 11 astronauts landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. And so it's really hard to kind of appreciate the significance the moon and NASA and Apollo and all that stuff had on the American public. And influenced a number of artists, not just visual artists, but all different types of artists and other individuals. And so Thomas makes a whole series of artworks that are kind of featuring space exploration, including the work on the left, which is called The Eclipse. This was done in 1970. And again, Thomas known for her great use of abstraction and color. And this particular work is part of her space series. She was motivated to do these works when she was following the Apollo, various other NASA programs. And color is one of the things. It's a key characteristic of Alma Thomas's work. And she said, color is life, and light is the mother of color. And she should know, she was an art teacher for decades. And a beautiful painting. And then here's another one. This is called Snoopy, Early Sun Display on Earth from 1970. Again, another great example of abstraction and color, part of her space series. And then I really enjoy learning about these artists' lives and what they're all about and what they thought and said and wrote and all that kind of stuff. So here's a couple interesting quotes from Alma Thomas, just so you can kind of get a sense of, you know, what some of these artists were like as people. I never married a man, but my art. What man would have ever appreciated what I was up to? And there was another instance. She said, once upon a time it was said, don't die having a miss on your tombstone. I feel very proud of having maintained my miss. I say that miss stands for all the jackasses I missed in life. A fine man is a delight, but for God's sake, don't get entangled with a jackass. So there you go. Words of wisdom from Alma Thomas. Oops, hold on one second. I lost the program here. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. Oh. Hold on for 1 second. Hold on for one moment. Okay, sorry about that. And another work by Alma Thomas. Now, if you want to see some more Alma Thomas's work, and you're in Washington, D.C., don't just go to the Smithsonian, go to the White House. Because in one of the White House, I think this is the family dining room where this painting is still at today. You can visit Alma Thomas's work, and the White House has a fabulous art collection. So if you have a chance, make sure you go visit, regardless of who the occupant is, or occupants. And then here's another great quote from Alma Thomas. Through my impressions of nature, I hope to impart beauty, joy, love, and peace. And that's Alma Thomas. So if you look at these three works side by side, you can see a lot of similarities. And that's another thing that's really neat about studying artists, when you kind of see a pattern in their work. Like, oh yeah, that's Alma Thomas. And she's gotten a lot of notoriety, I would say, in the past 5 or 10 years. She's been a well-known artist for a long time, but it seems like, to me, in my opinion, that her popularity has really increased a lot in the past 5 or 10 years. Here's another great artist. This is Augusta Savage. She's born in 1892. She passed away in 1962. She also was an artist and an educator. She takes part in the Great Migration. She moved from Florida to New York in 1921 as a young woman, and she was part of the Harlem Renaissance. And she also was a civil rights activist. And here's one of her works. It's called Gammon. It's from circa 1929. It's a bronze sculpture. The word gammon doesn't really have a perfect translation, but it's kind of a French word that kind of sort of means like streetwise children. I couldn't really think of like a better translation for that. This particular person, though, this particular sculpture was based on her nephew. He posed for this, and it's a well-known work of hers. This is a bronze, and there were several copies of the original made. So there's quite a few of these in different museums throughout the United States. So you might come across other versions of this at other museums, like perhaps by your home or in your travels. And then here's another view. I really like this sculpture as well. Just really captures kind of the essence of this young man. I don't know, just really like this a lot. It's really distinctive. And there's the back view. And the side view. And then there's a photograph of Augusta Savage. One of the things that's really cool about the Smithsonian American Art Museum at the National Portrait Gallery, they have a lot of images of famous people, and a lot of the famous people are artists. And so you can get a sense of, who are these people and what did they look like? So this is a photograph from 1942 of her. This particular artist did a whole series focusing on Black women, and really like how the artist here has kind of captured her beauty and her strength and kind of her triumph over all the different adverse events that she had in her life to become a successful artist and teacher. And then here she is, a couple images of her at work. This is the sculpture that I showed you, and then this particular one are two of her more famous works. And then here's a great quote from her. If I can inspire so she was an art teacher, and we're actually going to see works by one of her students. I won't spoil the surprise and tell you who the student was, but he, famous artist, was a pupil of hers. And she said in a quote, if I can inspire one of these youngsters to develop the talent I know they possess, then my monument will be in their work. She was a school teacher in Harlem, and her students loved her. There's numerous people wrote about the impact that she had on her life. So really cool that not only was she a talented, successful artist, she also inspired a lot of students with her teachings. And that's Augusta Savage. All right, so this has been Smithsonian Black and African American Art, part 1 of 2, where we featured not only Black and African American artists, but depictions of Blacks and African Americans by other, say, races. But this is just part 1 of 2. This kind of focused on artists that were born up until around 1900. And so we talked about Joshua Johnson, Edmonia Lewis, Henry Ossawa Tanner, Laura Wheeler Waring, Horace Pippin, Alma Thomas, Augusta Savage, a couple other artists that were kind of from this era, but we're going to talk about next time. James Van Der Zee, or a couple artists that we didn't get a chance to talk about that were from this era were James Van Der Zee and Archibald John Motley Jr. So if you kind of want to study artists from this era, we didn't get a chance to talk about these last 2 gentlemen, but you would probably want to research them on your own. We only had so much time, and we didn't get a chance to discuss them, but they're 2 great artists I want to recognize as well. All right, so this is part 1. Part 2 is going to be tomorrow night at the same time, and we'll be talking about a number of different artists as we continue our series. And who will we be discussing? Well, we'll be talking about William H. Johnson, Romare Bearden, Elzier Couture, Jacob Lawrence, Micheline Thomas, Gordon Parks. Again, these are all artists we'll be featuring in part 2 of our program tomorrow night. Kehinde Wiley, Amy Sherald, and that's Smithsonian Black and African American Art part 2 too. So I've got a couple other quick things to go over before we call it a night. But let's check back in with Patty. Hi, Patty. How you doing? Thanks again so much for joining us. Greatly appreciate that. Any final thoughts or tidbits before we wrap things up for the night?
I just love so many of these paintings, and there have been some great observations in both the chat and the Q&A. So people have really been appreciating this program in particular. So yeah, you can feel a sense of a distinct sense of culture in most of it that sets it aside. If nobody told you this is what we were going to do, I think if you had any familiarity with art, you would realize this is a separate category from what I'm used to.
Oh yeah, no, that's why I like American art so much. It really just kind of tells the story of America, American history, and American culture, regardless if it's Black and African American art or women's art or Civil War or whatever. So yeah, I really like this artwork a lot. Really glad I was able to share it with people.
We had a lot of questions too. The sculptures were so amazing and so intricately detailed, and a lot of people were asking questions about how long would something like that take. Do you have any ideas along those lines?
Oh, it really, and that's really a case by case basis. Really depends on the sculpture and how big it is and the artist and how fast they work. Yeah, it really depends. Like even a painting, some paintings, a person can do in a few hours or a few days, or sometimes they take months, and really kind of the same thing with sculpture. So really kind of case by case basis on that one, unfortunately.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was trying to explain, but my comparison to that of how stupendous that commitment is just the amount of time that I would try to contemplate doing something like that and know that it was impossible. So
oh yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, I'd never get past that point.
No, that's why I just talk about art, and I'm not an artist myself. So I totally understand. Thanks, Patty. All right. Well, again, thanks for joining. We've got a couple of things we can go over before we call it a night. Let's see. So this program is being recorded. I'll post the recording. I won't be able to do it tonight or tomorrow, but I'll probably try and do it on Sunday. It'll be on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. So you can be on the lookout for that. I'll try and email the link if I get a chance, although God, I've been really working a lot of hours at my job lately. But if I send the email link, you can be on the lookout for that. If I don't, just go to our flagship YouTube channel in a few days, and you'll be able to find it there. and also record, of course, part 2. We're a nonprofit organization. All the programs we do are sponsored by the general public. We don't get funding from anybody else. And we take the donations we receive and it helps pay for our Zoom, which costs a fair amount of money to have a number of people joining us each program that we do. It pays for our Eventbrite site, our Meetup site, the movies that we stream, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to support the work we do, you can do so via PayPal, Venmo, GoFundMe, et cetera, et cetera. So this has been the Smithsonian Black and African American Part 1. We'll do Part 2 tomorrow. Thanks for joining us. Hold on, let me, I wanted to stop the recording.